Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
We come now again to another segment of our ongoing series that we call Proper Theology. You may remember that we named this series Proper Theology as a kind of play on words because our goal is to cover what is called in technical circles theology proper. Theology proper. When we speak of theology in its broadest sense, we include not only the study of God, but the study of man and their relationship and how we're saved and what's going to happen in history and all those kinds of things. But when we speak of it in a more narrow sense, we're speaking specifically about who God is. That's theology proper. And so, today I'd like us to remember about who God is, that he is a God who is active. It has long been my complaint that those of us who rightly affirm that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, who affirm that God is sovereign over all things, that God wrote out the story of history before time even began, can fall into a kind of practical deism. The deists, you will remember, or those who took the view that there had to be a God in order to explain the existence of the universe. And so they said, yes, God created the world, and then he took a walk and he'll never come back. God has nothing to do with us. Well, what's a practical deism is a deism that doesn't say God has nothing to do with us, but that says, because God wrote the story, it's like winding a clock, or it's like he pushes the first domino, he set up all the dominoes before all time, and now history is just taking its natural course, and God is up there distant watching. Well, God is up there distant watching. God did push the domino. God did write the story, but God wrote himself into the story. I often try to help people understand this principle by reminding them of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, we know, was the greatest writer probably of the English language ever. What we often forget is that he was also an actor. And when Shakespeare would write his plays, often he would know in advance what part he was going to play in the story. Well, God is like Shakespeare in the sense that he has written the story. But in the story, he's an actor. He does things. God wrote before all time that the Holy Spirit would descend upon Mary and she would conceive. And God, the Holy Spirit, did that in space and time. And God the Son became incarnate in space and in time. God determined from before all time that he would speak to Moses out of the burning bush. And when he spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, he was acting in space and time. When he performed all of those miracles that brought Pharaoh to his knees, he was acting in space and time. And friends, he still does so. He is at work. He is busy. God the Son is at work sanctifying his bride. God the Spirit is at work working with us to grow in grace and wisdom and giving life to those who are dead. And God the Father is superintending it all. And he is the one who draws near to us and who takes us in his arms and loves us as a father loves his child. No father is merely aloof and distant. No father merely plans the future of his children. but he's with them, and he loves them, and he's active in their lives. The same is true of the living God. We need to remember that we live our lives coram Deo, before the face of God, which means so much more than he can see us from a distance. I like to put it this way. When I feel like my prayers aren't making it past the ceiling in the room I'm in, I take comfort in knowing that he's in the room with me. That my prayers don't have to travel some great distance to get to him. Because he's with me, and he's not with me in a straitjacket. He's with me with his strong right arm. Friends, we need to beware the yeast. We need to beware the yeast of modernism that looks at the world as a clock, as a machine, that looks at history as the winding down of that clock. We're not in a closed system. We're in a system that he made. We're in a system that he planned. And we're in a system that he is in with us. God is active. Do not lose heart. Do not make the mistake of thinking that he is distant and aloof. He's with you wherever you are. And so let us all be bold and strong. Last week in our segment, Heroes You Never Heard Of, I sort of pulled a Time magazine, who from time to time, instead of giving us a Man of the Year, gives us a group of men or some ideology or some fictional character or something. And I gave you a group of people as my heroes, talking about those students at the old Ligonier Valley Study Center who put on a very successful kind of haunted house for the study center kids back in 1972 probably. Well, in the account of that, I mentioned one of the students, and I thought, she really deserves her own full segment as being a hero that you never heard of. Sadly, I don't remember her last name, but I told one of the stories already. I'm going to recount it very briefly, but I want to tell a second story that I didn't include. The first story was this. When I was a kid, I'm always asking these students, would you play football with us? Would you take us to the candy store? Would you go camping with us? And Rosie, I asked if she would go fishing. I mentioned that we had a pond on the property that was fed by a lake in the property right next door, and mostly we had tadpoles and bluegills, but from time to time a bass would find its way into our pond, and how Rosie sat there, got up early while it was still dark, and went out there with me and sat in the ground and fished with me for an hour or more, and we got nothing. And eventually, I thought she had run out of patience, and she said, "Oh, Craig," because that's what I was known by then. "Oh, Craig, I think it's probably time for us to head in. Would you mind reeling in my line for me?" And I thought myself quite gallant and took that line from her and began to reel it in when I discovered, holy cow, there was a fish on the line. And I reeled it in, and it was literally the biggest fish I ever caught as a kid. It was a 2-pound bass. It took me many, many years to realize, that fish was already on that line, and Rosie asking me to reel it in was her being kind to let me catch it. Well, one thing I should mention is that there was quite a bit of sort of cross-pollination between Ligonier Valley Study Center and other ministries in the area. One of the groups that we did so much of the training for was a group called Coalition for Christian Outreach, and Coalition would send couples out to local colleges to serve as resident directors in the dorms, and they would have ministry there. All sorts of different groups like that. That sometimes there would be college students from some of these colleges that would come down to the study center or take classes at the study center. But also there was First Presbyterian Church Camp, which was the camp that belonged to First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, but the camp itself was located in Ligonier. And for a couple of summers, I got to go to camp there at First Pres Church Camp. It was 2 weeks long. I just can't believe that I was gone that long, but I was. And a number of people that I knew from the study center would work there in the summers as counselors, or one of those fellows was Bob Ingram. Bob used to take people from his college. I think he went to Geneva College. He used to take carloads of kids down for Gab Fests at the Ligonier Valley Study Center. He was a regular there at the study center, and then he was a counselor at First Pres Church Camp, and eventually he married the woman who served as the head lifeguard, Mean Margene. And eventually Bob and Margene were moved to Orlando, where Bob served as the head of the education department at Ligonier Ministries, and he was my boss. But Rosie also ended up as a counselor at camp. And I remember thinking how great that was, that Rosie was one of the counselors. But she was one of the counselors for the girls. I didn't really get to have much interaction with her. But somehow, some way, I remember I was with some other student. Maybe it was a girl student. But Rosie sat down and she started talking with me and this other camper. And she told me this story. You may have heard it before. I know she didn't come up with it herself, but it just blew me away and knocked me over. And I still love it to this day. You know the story. There's a little girl, very, very sick. She's in the hospital. And one day, the doctors and the parents come to her brother. And they say, Jimmy, your sister's very sick. But if we can give her blood from your body, she will live. Are you willing to do that? And Jimmy says, yes, I'm willing to do that. And they set up the transfusion, and his sister's unconscious, and they stick the needle in the arm of the little boy, and he watches as the blood flows out of his veins and into his sister, and he begins to see her color return. But eventually he asked the doctor this question: will it hurt? The doctor was puzzled because the needle had already been put there. He said, well, what hurt? The boy said, when I die. Because he thought he was being asked to give all of his blood to his sister, to lay down his life for his sister. That's a powerful image of Christ. It's a great surprise at the end of the story. But it also revealed the heart of Rosie, who wanted to see kids brought into the kingdom. Now, I don't know if you know a Rosie. I don't know if you know a Rosie who was around Western Pennsylvania in the mid-'70s or early '70s. But if you do, I would love it if you would just tell her she's still a hero to me. And I'm still grateful for her preaching the gospel to my young ears. I'd like to say that it was my first C that I ever received as a grade in college, but it was my second C. My first C was in my New Testament class my freshman year, and I'd like to say that those two C's were my worst grades, but they weren't. The semester before I got my first C, my very first semester at college, I got a D in Old Testament. The second C, though, was quite a surprise to me, because the class that I got the C in was taught by Dr. Andy Hoffecker, who was my guy, who I probably got A's from in every other class, and I took everything that he taught. Well, I got that C when he happened to teach church history. And I mention that because I was never a church history guy. Wasn't a strong suit for me. When I was in seminary, I had church history again, this time with Frank Farrell, who was quite a gifted thinker and teacher and very influential behind-the-scenes guy who worked very closely with Carl Henry and with Billy Graham in the early years of the new evangelical movement. And in that class, I don't remember exactly how well I did, not too terribly well, but I remember slogging my way through the 2 volumes of Kenneth Latteret's church history, all of which is introduction to today's Curating Your Book library, because today I commend to your reading The Church in History by R.B. Kuyper, Kuiper. I have taught through The Church in History and read through it and found it to be just an excellent church history. If you've got an interest in church history, that's where I'd encourage you to begin. Now, full disclosure, The Church in History is, as most of the books that I commend, it's not a difficult read. It's not going to stretch you and use a lot of jargon you're unfamiliar with. But there's a reason for that, because the book was actually designed to be a church history book, either for high schoolers or even middle schoolers. Kuyper, with a name like Kuyper, you wouldn't be surprised to know, comes from the Dutch Reformed tradition, which has a long history of parochial schools that taught the Dutch Reformed tradition. And so they used this book for many, many years. In fact, it sold 150,000 copies, many of them in the context of Christian schooling. But I don't want you to be ashamed. You know, the point of a good book, any good book should be readable by a high schooler, and any book that's readable by a high schooler has plenty of room to be helpful to anybody. It's not beneath me, it shouldn't be beneath you to read a book written for high schoolers if it's well done, and this one is. What you get in The Church in History is a very successful balance of depth and brevity. I mean, my stars. The Latterette, 2-volume Latterette series is literally probably 8 inches tall if you stacked one book on top of the other. That's a lot of reading, and even it, of course, doesn't cover everything or doesn't cover to absolute depths. But what Kuyper does is he really does an outstanding job of covering his bases, of giving insight and background without beating any dead horses. He has happily, and this also maybe comes out of his Dutch Reformed background, he has a conviction, a good, healthy conviction that God is sovereign, that he is at work. You won't get from R.B. Kuyper the kind of church history that looks at the church as merely the machinations of men. He is giving us the work of God in the spread of the gospel, in the establishment of his church across space and time. That's a good thing. And, it would be really, really helpful for most of us to have some basic grasp of church history. It's just good to have things in context. It's good to understand the theological battles that went on throughout church history because they continue to go on. One of the things you'll see and learn is that no matter how firmly an error might be denounced or rejected or determined to be heretical, it never just simply slinks away and disappears, never to be heard from again, but it gets repackaged, reshaped, and comes back again, because not only is God real and in charge, but the devil is real and he is active. So, my commendation for you is to check out R.B. Kuiper, Kuiper, R.B. Kuiper's The Church in History. If you have read it, if you're going to read it, as always, I would sorely love to hear from you and to get your thoughts on the matter. I'm guessing if you've read it, I would be quite surprised to get any complaints from anybody about it. So let that be another commendation for you. But if you want to prove me wrong and you got a beef, let me know. Either way, let us hear from you.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.